Welcome to another STARS webinar. I am David Earn, Director of Programs and Communication at STARS. For those of you who are here for the first time, STARS webinars are interactive discussions about future-oriented topics such as leadership, geopolitics, technology, climate change, and health. A select group of people is attending the webinar live, asking their own questions, and hundreds more watch it later on as a recording in STARS Insights or on YouTube. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Today we talk with Professor Dr. Volker PERTHES about how Europe can secure its strategic autonomy and become a global player in a multipolar world. Volker is Senior Advisor and former Director of SWP, the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, a think tank which primarily advises the German Parliament and federal government on foreign and security policy issues. He also taught as adjunct professor at Humboldt University, Berlin, and as UN Assistant Secretary General. Volker supported the UN Special Envoy for Syria and headed the UN Ceasefire Task Force for Syria. His areas of expertise include German and European foreign and security policy, geopolitics and international relations, international organizations, as well as regional dynamics in the Middle East. Volker is also a member of the STARS Scientific Board. Good morning to you, Volker, and thank you for speaking in today's webinar.
Good morning, David. Good to see you.
We now have 30 minutes to discuss with Volker. I will take the privilege to ask the first couple questions. In the meantime, if you have any questions for Volker, please use the Q&A feature below to type in your question. Without any further ado, let's get right into it. Europe is often described as an economic giant, a political dwarf, and a military worm. Amid the new great power competition between the United States and China, how do you assess Europe's ability and willingness to become a global player in its own right?
Well, David, arguably, Europe is a global player already, and I would say it has been a global player for a long time, but it depends a lot on sort of what aspects of global politics and global influence taking and power you look at. It is certainly an economic superpower, you said so. It has been a regulatory superpower. The question whether Europe remains a standard setter globally, I think depends very much on how it uses its own power resources. And what we mainly focus upon in this world of increasing great power competition is military power and the way to use military power for geopolitical ends. Here, Europe's development, as it were, is work in progress. There is more power wielded by Europe in its environment than, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago, but it is still clear that Europe, for example, cannot defend itself alone. It is not autonomous in its defense. There is an argument whether it actually should be or whether alliances are a beautiful thing. And one can choose one's own alliances, and we have done so. It is not even autonomous in projecting power and stability into its own close environment. Like, just give 1 or 2 examples. We cannot enforce an arms embargo on Libya ourselves. We cannot enforce peace in Syria ourselves, and not even with others. So there is work in progress, no doubt.
What do you see then as the biggest challenges for the EU and its member states to achieve this greater strategic autonomy?
Well, the biggest challenges now are coming from outside Europe. It's the undermining of a multilateral order by different players, by the big players. It's the return to big power geopolitics and big power competition. And that enforces upon Europe this discussion, this debate about strategic autonomy or European sovereignty or whatever you call it. Now, what do we have to do? What do we have to make out of? Where do we start? What are the challenges for, as you asked, strategic autonomy or European sovereignty? I think the first thing is that Europe has to start set its priorities itself. And then once you have been able to set your priorities and not have 52 priorities, but boil it down to what really is a priority, then you will find out easily, and I think you can much more easily agree on what's necessary means are you need to develop, or in many more cases, you simply need to combine. Militarily, Europe is not a dwarf if you look at the combined potentials, but we are not combining them. Then Europe is a bit bigger than the European Union. And here I don't mean Switzerland, allow me to say that, but I rather mean other NATO members. I mean the United Kingdom, I mean Norway. So if you combine military power in Europe, it's quite impressive, but we have a lot of duplication. And if you speak of military power, we are certainly much more effective if we think of a European pillar of NATO than thinking about the European Union as a military geostrategic player. But then when I speak about combining resources, power resources for the priorities which we need to set, we do have, and we spoke about that in the beginning, the economic cloud. We have the single market as a real instrument to wield influence in the world, but we have not yet decided, or probably not yet learned, to use the economic cloud for other than economic gains or other than economic interests. Why not do what we complain about when others do it, that is using our own economic cloud also in order to promote our strategic goals. We do it a little bit on a strategic goal, but definitely as a strategic goal like climate change. We don't do it on geopolitical goals so far.
Germany is not the EU's hegemon, but for many member states, it is nevertheless the leading nation. So what role can or should Germany play to steer the EU towards more strategic autonomy?
Let me call it consensus building leadership. Germans have been very hesitant to speak about Germany as a hegemon or a leading power, but it is clear that there are many things that Germany cannot do alone in the EU, definitely not, but there is no one else who could do it. And that is building consensus on the priorities. And sometimes Germany, in partnership with others, is good at that. I think the recent agreement on a recovery fund for Europe and the budget of the European Union has been a very good example of Germany, together with France, building a consensus in the EU. It's not yet all done, but it will be done, and I'm pretty sure, in a short time. Europe also, to go more to geopolitics, under the co-leadership, together with others, of Germany, has been able to maintain sanctions on Russia now for more than 6 years, which is something certainly Moscow and others didn't expect 6 years ago. So here Germany has been able to build that consensus. That's not hegemonic, but it is something which no one else could do, and the Germans never can do alone. In other cases, we have failed. Germany has failed on building a consensus on migration issues, for example, so far. Germany has tried to build a consensus on policy towards Libya in our immediate neighborhood. It has been half successful only here, but of course, that's not only a question among European partners.
We have 2 questions about Swiss and European security policy, and I'd like to take them together. Daniel Wocher, he's the former Swiss ambassador to Australia. He's asking, how can Switzerland contribute to a European security policy? And Bruno Gehrig, a board member of Merki Baumann, he is writing, in terms of security policy, it is clear that it is not individual countries, but Europe as a whole that is coming under pressure. How do you see the military political efforts in Europe, also in the context of NATO? What is the role of Switzerland as a non-EU country in this context? And specifically, would it be a good idea if Switzerland made a contribution to Europe's military and political defense, for instance, in the form of 40 modern fighter jets?
Look, I think Switzerland has a great tradition in making sure that it cannot be pushed around itself, and so it has a defense force which would be a nuisance to everybody who would think about invading Switzerland, and I think it's good at that, and it's probably enough. And I think every country should, and the EU as a union should choose a domain in where it makes a contribution. So I don't think that's the main contribution of Switzerland or Austria or Liechtenstein, for that matter, would be in the defense field, in the military defense field. I think Switzerland's contribution to other burdens of international security, which always includes human security, to international security and peace are much more important, and more important what Switzerland does in context of the International Committee of the Red Cross, what Switzerland does as a mediator. So I don't think that anybody in the NATO headquarters would ask for the contribution of Swiss fighter jets or Swiss tanks or Swiss militias. Here, I think Switzerland is good as what it does for itself, but keep being a good international citizen. I think that's much more important. And then there are of course, areas, spaces, domains where I think Switzerland and the Swiss people, you're doing referendums every second week, sometimes about European issues, should actually be more aware that were you not surrounded by the European Union, you would be in a much worse state security-wise. So there is a good case for coordinating on migration. There is a good case for coordinating on all kinds of connectivity, and probably realize that your own national sovereignty is also owed to the security of being embedded geographically into the European Union.
To truly become a global player, Europe has to define itself as an independent pole in a multipolar setting that is increasingly determined by Sino-American rivalry. So how could the EU achieve greater autonomy from the US?
Look, basically what you say is right. Either Europe is going to be a pole in this multipolarized and multipolar world, or it is going to be polarized inside itself. And that is something which some European countries and societies or parts of societies have not yet learned, that only by uniting our forces, by combining our capacities, by combining our power resources, we will also avoid internal fragmentation. It is not about independence from the United States. I think it is much more about building a more symmetric partnership. Today, the partnership is asymmetric. I think it will remain asymmetric in the way that Europe is dependent for its defense on the United States, but vice versa. That's not true. The US is not dependent on Europe for its defense. It is sometimes dependent on European support in burden sharing, but that's a different thing. So we will not have complete symmetry here, even if we build up our capacities all across the board of the instruments of statehood and state art, as it were. But we can build a more symmetric partnership. We should go to the United States, particularly if there is a new administration now, in beginning of next year, and sort of outline to our partners in the US how a fair, equitable, more symmetric burden sharing could look like. And that would bring the discussion, I think, away from only speaking about defense spending. Speak about everything that has to do with international stability. Speak about the combination of defense, diplomacy, development, about contributions to humanitarian aid, about contributions to trying to avoid climate change on a great level. I mean, that's all contributions to international peace and security. And there we need a rational discussion between grown-ups, as it were, about what an equitable, fair burden sharing would be. That's not independence, that's a more symmetric partnership. We have, after all, let me add that, um, there is a value connection between the United States and Europe that will not go away. And even if we are not happy with the way some Americans or parts of the US are speaking about decoupling from China, and we, as much as our partners in the ASEAN countries, for example, don't want a decoupled world. So there is no doubt in the end that we have chosen an alliance with the United States, and we will not choose an alliance with China.
China, in many ways, pursues a policy of divide and rule towards the EU, selectively rewarding and punishing individual EU member states depending on their political and economic importance. So why does Europe still not have a robust and collective China policy?
Well, it's been more than one actor that has tried to play a divide and rule policy towards Europe in the last couple of years. China has doing that in a way through institution buildings, a 17+1, and as you said, try to reward individual politicians and censor others, or try to punish countries like Sweden or Norway, which is not an EU member. That's true. But we have also seen such attempts by the United States to divide and rule by building very special relations with Poland, for example, and trying to invest Poland in its Middle East policies and other issues. And here we come back to if we don't set our priorities together and become a pole, we will be polarized because we will allow others to polarize. Does Europe have a common China policy? I would say it is on the way of having one. We have had this communication from the European Commission last year, strategic outlook on China, which I think is a very, very significant paper, and no member country has spoken out against it. It is a paper that defines the relationship, Europe's relationship to China, and not in a simplistic way as we think the US national security strategy is doing it, where it's simply about China as a revisionist power. But this European paper makes very clear that China is different things to us. It is a cooperation partner on many issues. It is an economic competitor on many issues, but it is also an ideological competitor or a systemic competitor in the way of what we think is good governance, what we think is a good society. And that's the competition that I think we can proudly enter into with our democratic model, which has served us all very well. And we have been building common instruments like investment screening, which is a very important step on sort of protecting our own critical industries and critical infrastructure. And we have learned in the financial crisis, when we all had, not individually all had, but when the common philosophy was that countries like Greece have to privatize as soon as possible, no one found it strange that the port of Piraeus would be sold to a Chinese company. I don't think that would happen today. So even though there are individual differences about the formats, how we engage China or allow China to engage us, there is a common policy which is gradually being built. Now, Corona has made that a little bit more difficult. There was the idea of having a common summit this past September in Germany under the German EU Council presidency, where all the 27 states would come together with a Chinese leadership. And I think that would have been a dual message, and the right dual message. A, we all want to remain engaged with China about economic cooperation on the ecology and sustainability in the world. We have different ideas about multilateralism, but we agree that multilateralism needs to be strengthened. At the same time, it's all the 27 together, and we don't allow China or anybody else to divide us into small groups.
The next question comes from STARS alumnus Dominic von Planta. He's CEO of Schwind iTech Solutions. He's writing, you mentioned setting priorities and combining military potential as a path to political autonomy. How can Europe in the current leadership structure get there? What does it take?
Well, the simple answer is it takes political will, but I know that that is not enough of an answer. Now, combining military forces, my choice here is to keep the European Union's own CSDP, as we call it, Common Security and Defense Policy, in the realm of interventions, either at our own borders in order to deal with all kind of hybrid threats, or for stabilization operations in our neighborhood. But when it comes to defense and deterrence, then it would be about strengthening the European pillar of NATO. That is where we have the real hard power, and the big advantage is that the United Kingdom is a member here of NATO and will remain, and of course it remains a European power, even though not inside the EU. Setting priorities is about closest coordination and ongoing discussions between the member states on an EU level. Some attempts have been made here by speaking about a common, it's actually being developed, a common strategic compass. That sounds very European, sounds like a new format, and but what does it mean? It's actually a common planning process, or a common threat perception and planning process, where European states find out together, together with the European Union and the Brussels institution, what actually the challenges and threats and opportunities are in our environment. I do have an answer to the question whether priorities should lie. And again, I'm not going to mention 54, but the number one priority for us is stability in our environment. And while we have a lot of good ideas, what we could do with the forces of individual member states, we could have a German frigate steaming the South China Sea. That's what some of our friends in the Asian countries would suggest to us to do. Well, I'm not against it. Actually, I would rather have a German-French frigate go there with a combined team of German and French sailors. But that is not what makes our strategic autonomy. And that is not what brings us respect among the big powers, Russia or China or the US or India, anybody else, if we don't at the same time get our own neighborhood right. So the priority for me is peace and stability in our own neighborhood. That starts in the Western Balkans, and that includes, of course, the opposite coast of the Mediterranean. If we fail here, if we cannot get, let's say, the Mediterranean and the Mediterranean environment right, or the Baltic environment right, for that matter, then why should anybody actually give a lot of attention to the frigate in the South China Sea, or on what we have to say on geopolitical conflicts in Asia?
We have a follow-up question on the EU's institutional makeup. The question comes from STARS alumnus Joachim Sarda. He's a member of the executive board of Hilti. He's asking, how do you see the development of internal governance in the EU, from free union to federation, as an enabler to become a coherent pole in global geopolitics?
Well, I guess we have learned that the philosophical expression of having an ever close union is not shared by everybody, and sort of doesn't go along with the sentiments and the identities of many of the people, or large parts of the societies in Europe. So it is more a building efficient structures where the European Union, regardless whether it is union policy or whether it is Brussels institution commission policy, where the European Union actually gives added value to the well-being of Europe, to the security of Europe and all of its citizens, where we realize that our national sovereignty, which no one wants to give up. No one, not even the most pro-European states want to give up their national sovereignty. Well, we realize that our national sovereignty will only be protected if at the same time we build a European sovereignty, and if we do it together. Could put it differently and say the national sovereignty of the 27 states is only protected if they protect it together. And the best framework for that, which we have, is the European Union. I don't care too much about the question whether another competency is going to the European Commission, or whether we can do that together as 27 states, which often works better. I think there are some institutional ideas on the table which are worth thinking about, like a European Security Council, which would go beyond the European Union, include the United Kingdom. That's a great idea. I'm not sure whether all the European states are up to that, because it would, for example, mean that if you want the United Kingdom in a decision-making body of Europe without being member of the European Union, we would also have to give them a say, not a veto, but at least a voice in common institutions like the European Defence Fund. That's something which I think is would be the right way to go, the right path to go, because Britain would certainly, the United Kingdom would certainly contribute to the development of defense instruments in Europe. But for some member states, particularly right now, where we are still discussing the way the United Kingdom will leave the European Union and the future relationships, that's probably one step too much. But I think sort of in the longer run, that's one of the institutional developments which we might see in Europe.
We have two questions on the principle of anonymity, so I'd like to take them together as well. The first question is coming from Hakan Hedström. He's head of Asian investment strategy at Zurich Insurance. He's writing, recently Cyprus was blocking a common EU decision. With these kind of rules, the EU will never gain international reputation. What do you propose in order to reform the voting rights system? And Bruno Gehrig, board member of Merki Baumann, he writes, with the principle of anonymity, Europe will never be able to link business and politics. So we have the common market as an asset, but we cannot use this asset politically. Do you see scenarios of moving away from the principle of anonymity without our continent falling apart politically?
Well, the answer is, what I wish is clearly that that we have a form of qualified majority voting even on foreign policy and security policy. The challenge is not to wish for that. The challenge is to actually get there. And even if you want to get there, you need unanimity. I mean, you cannot decide to change the rules, which would, in some cases, exclude the vote or sort of makes the vote irrelevant of certain states without the consent of all. So I think we are going there for the time being. I think some states have felt the heat for their attempts to block a common European policy, and we just seen that the Commission has turned up the screws a little, turned tighter the screws a little bit on Cyprus and Malta for their passport policy, and they are about to change it, which is overdue. It's necessary, but they are doing it now. So they are falling in line in the end, because of course Cyprus knows that it would be in a much worse stage if it wasn't in the European Union. It would be all alone there in the Mediterranean in a very uncomfortable situation. So yes, they tried their luck, but I think they have also realized that they overdid it a little bit, and so they backed down in the end. We see that in some cases we had to take the detour, and it certainly institutionalized a detour, to have declarations of the European Union in the name of 25 or 26. We have had to do that in the United Nations and sometimes even from Brussels. But that is probably the way to show that Europe, with the largest majority of its member countries, the European Union was the largest majority of its member countries, is on one course here, and even if one or two states dissent and don't want to sort of out of solidarity, which they expect in other cases, vote with the rest of the European Union, Europe is still able to act. There is a institutional way which would avoid sort of harsh voting, which would be sort of what is called a constructive abstention, that countries who really don't think that this particular foreign policy or security policy decision is in their interest would abstain from voting without blocking, and basically make a protocol note that they will not contribute own resources to the action that necessarily should follow the declaration.
The next question comes from Heinrich Lanz, president of Swiss Contact. His question is about migration. Migration is an issue that threatens European unity and stability. How can Europe better deal with migration?
Look, again, you're right. Migration is one of the issues, and I mentioned it, where neither Germany nor anybody else, not the Commission, has been able to build a consensus in the European Union, particularly when the wave of migrants from the Middle East tried to enter Europe and partly entered Europe in 2015. We have learned from that. We have become better prepared to deal with the next waves of migration. We have not allowed Turkey to blackmail us on that. We have pushed back against some attempts from Turkey to use migrants as a political instrument. Now, that has not always been pretty, but I think it has been rather effective over the last 12 to 24 months or so. And the principle, which there are intensive discussions going on, and I think we will have a compromise by next year at the latest. I would hope we would still have it now under the German presidency. The compromise formula, and it's more a formula, it's more a principle than a formula, is some form of sort of divided solidarity, you could say. You could call it, or traversal solidarity, as I've called it. There are countries which, for reasons which I may politically not be in agreement with, simply say that they don't want to accept refugees or migrants from non-Christian countries. Now, I can have a strong political position on that, but do I want to threaten European unity over that difference? No, I don't want it. So I would say if their societies or their politics don't allow that, or think that they cannot stomach it, then let them contribute in other ways to European migration policies than by taking in a couple of migrants. Wouldn't be great numbers anyway, because these are usually rather small countries population-wise. So if they instead can contribute with their own forces, or with money, to Frontex, or if they, Frontex is the European Frontier Agency, if they can contribute to concrete measures like bringing not accepted, refused asylum seekers back to their home countries, if they can contribute to development projects in countries where migrants come from, then that is, I think, a compromise we can deal with.
I would like to briefly touch on technology and finance before we have to, sadly, already wrap up. It seems that for the foreseeable future, Europe will not be in a position to catch up with China and the United States in the digital economy. So where should Europe put its focus to develop technological capabilities?
Well, I think the gap we are having here is not so much in research. The gap is, and I'm not a specialist on this issue, the gap is in commercializing research. We have a lot of patents still in Germany and other European countries, also in the digital field, in the digital technology field. A lot of things that are being invented here, even in the in the very contested field of artificial intelligence. We're having these new centers in Germany and in France. We're getting back to Germany a couple of that's another migration issue of European migrants that went to the United States but are coming back because they are seeing that the opportunities for research in Europe have actually been strengthened in their field. Now that's a very, very good first step. What we still haven't managed is building a business culture that, or a public culture that supports business in commercializing the research and the patents which we get. If we were able to do that, I think we would be rather quickly able, probably not to close the gap, but to build that what European politicians call digital sovereignty. That's not about keeping American tech giants out. It's not even about keeping Chinese giants out, but it is about it's about building our own strength this year. We see that in the very contested field of 5G, two of the companies in the world that actually can do it are European companies in Finland and in Sweden, or from Finland and from Sweden. Do we have to put more money into industrial policy, build up strong European conglomerates that can compete with the ones like Huawei? I think we should.
Since it was established over 20 years ago, the euro has become the second most important currency in a still dollar-dominated financial system. How do you see the future of the euro? Should the EU try to more proactively push the euro to become established as a global reserve currency?
I think if you just have a political program to do that, it will not succeed. I mean, you have to convince the markets. The recovery fund and common European borrowing certainly will raise, and has already raised, the interest of a lot of investors, and could, but not that that was a political aim of it, but it could also strengthen the relevance of the euro among other international currencies. There is one geopolitical question which is directly linked to dollar domination and what we can do with the euro, and that is that Europe, the European Union here, is quite efficient and effective, both efficient and effective, on imposing sanctions on others, but we are totally ineffective in defending against secondary sanctions set by other countries. Today, that's mostly US sanctions, but I wouldn't exclude that tomorrow it would be Chinese sanctions if some European companies, for example, don't want to contribute to Belt and Road initiatives, that these countries would be sanctions, and even secondary sanctions would be imposed by China. And of course, currencies play an enormous role here. Now it is the dollar. I think we have tried to build up a finance mechanism in order to finance trade with Iran, which has been heavily sanctioned by the US. Switzerland is doing a similar thing in close cooperation, actually, as I understand, with the State Department in the US, because it's basically for humanitarian deliveries. One of the ways to go certainly is to establish the euro as a digital currency, and make international payments from Europe to the rest of the world, or from the rest of the world to Europe, more independent from the dollar.
We have time for one final question, and the question comes from Maria Lanzeni. She's head of macro risks and trends at Deutsche Bank. She's interested in your opinion on Russia and Belarus. What kind of EU policy do you expect towards Russia and Belarus in the coming weeks and months?
Well, ideally, we would separate the two and have a policy on Belarus, which doesn't politicize the issue. We have a country here, Belarus, that is part of the so-called Eastern Partnership with the European Union, and where we clearly have seen that presidential elections, as a result of presidential elections, have been falsified. There is an enormous protest movement in the population, which has been going on for weeks and weeks now. It is not upon us to decide who is the president of Belarus, not at all, but putting pressure on Belarus to have a real dialogue with the population, and probably having a round table between the opposition and the government of Belarus. That should be the European policy, not fostering, furthering regime change, but furthering and supporting dialogue inside Belarus. And ideally, Russia would support this. They are interested, they should be interested in a stable neighbor themselves. So far, Russia is clearly unhappy with what is happening in Belarus, but fears change more than a repressive regime that would keep itself in power by repressive means. Our disputes with Russia are over different things, mainly not about Belarus. They are about Ukraine, they are about the Russian intervention in the Donbass and their support, their active support of the civil war in Ukraine. Our disputes are about disinformation and hybrid interventions in different European countries. But I think we don't want to make Belarus another geopolitical East-West Russia-EU issue as Ukraine unfortunately has become.
With that, I would like to thank you very much, Volker, for your time and for sharing your insights with us. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thanks to all the participants.
I would also like to thank all our alumni who participated today. In the next STARS webinar on the 13th of November, we talk with Diana Ong, Chief People Officer of Singapore's Sovereign Wealth Fund, GIC, about her personal leadership experience, the impact of technology on the future of work, and the leadership qualities needed to thrive in the new normal. I hope to see you there. In the meantime, take care and stay healthy. Thank you and goodbye.